After a powerful earthquake in a remote sector of Yellowstone, a ranger discovers a stone house hidden beneath a hillside, a structure that never appeared in any official records. A few details inside make one thing clear. This place was hidden on purpose, and the truth behind it is far more dangerous than it seems. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The transfer order arrived without ceremony, folded into a routine packet of assignments that rarely carried any sense of consequence. The ranger had learned long ago that the most remote sectors were often given to those who asked the fewest questions or those whose presence would not attract attention. This one lay deep within Yellowstone, far from visitor centers, far from postcard viewpoints, a stretch of land marked on internal maps by thin lines and cautious notes about unstable terrain and limited access. It was a sector shaped more by silence than by scenery, a place most patrols passed along the edges of rather than through. He accepted it without objection, packed his gear, and drove for hours along roads that narrowed until they were no longer paved, then narrowed again until they were little more than compressed dirt cutting through dense forest. The briefing he received upon arrival was brief and functional. A minor earthquake had passed through the region days earlier, nothing severe enough to alarm the public, but enough to disturb slopes that had been resting under tension for decades. His task was straightforward: inspect trails, assess damage, mark hazardous areas, and report any changes that might threaten safety. There was no mention of anything unusual, no emphasis placed on the sector beyond its isolation. The land, they told him, had always been difficult to manage. Shifting ground, thick tree cover, limited visibility from the air. Nature, as always, was the explanation offered in advance. The first patrol began at dawn. Light filtered through tall conifers, their trunks dark and massive, their crowns interlocking so tightly that the sky appeared in fragments rather than open space. The forest floor was damp and uneven, scattered with broken branches, stones loosened by the tremor, and stretches where the soil had cracked and settled into unfamiliar shapes. He moved carefully, noting changes, marking coordinates, documenting displaced signage and sections of trail that had warped or collapsed. There were places where the earth seemed to have slid as a single body, leaving behind clean edges that felt almost deliberate, as if the land itself had chosen where to give way. As he moved deeper into the sector, the sense of abandonment became more pronounced. Old boundary markers leaned at odd angles, some half swallowed by vegetation. A service road, long removed from use, faded into the forest without warning, its path broken by roots and erosion. The absence of recent human presence was not unusual in Yellowstone, but here it felt concentrated, intentional, as though the area had been allowed to drift quietly out of notice. He logged the details with professional detachment, though the pattern unsettled him in ways he could not yet articulate. The slope that drew his attention lay beyond a stand of tall pines, where the land rose sharply and then fell away toward a shallow ravine. From a distance, it looked like any other hillside shaped by centuries of weather and slow movement. Up close, the change was unmistakable. A section of the hill had collapsed inward, not chaotically, but in a broad sliding motion that exposed layers of compacted soil and stone beneath. The debris field spread outward in a fan, recent enough that vegetation had not yet begun to reclaim it. As he approached, something about the exposed surface disrupted his expectation of natural forms. Among the fractured earth and broken rock, there was a line that did not belong. It was straight where nothing else was, edged where erosion should have been uneven. He knelt, brushed aside loose dirt, and uncovered stone that had been cut and placed, not formed by chance. The outline continued beneath his hands, revealing a corner, then the suggestion of a wall. He stepped back to take it in. The hillside had not merely collapsed, it had peeled away. Embedded within it was a structure, its shape obscured but unmistakable now that it had revealed itself. Stone masonry emerged from the earth with a solidity that defied its surroundings. This was not a remnant of a foundation or a scattered ruin. It was intact, deliberate, and concealed so thoroughly that it had remained invisible until the land itself had shifted. He marked the coordinates and began a cautious survey of the area. The structure was larger than it first appeared, extending into the slope in both directions, its roof buried under a thick layer of soil and vegetation. Grass and moss clung to its surface as if it were a natural extension of the hill rather than something built. From a distance before the collapse, there would have been no indication of its presence at all. Closer inspection revealed stone steps descending toward a recessed entrance, partially exposed by the slide. The steps were worn but not destroyed, their edges rounded by time rather than shattered by force. The doorway was framed by heavy stonework, the opening dark and silent. There were no signs warning visitors away, no record on his maps, no indication that this place existed in any official capacity. He checked for fresh animal activity and found little. No claw marks, no disturbed nesting, no evidence that wildlife had claimed the structure as shelter. The ground around the entrance was oddly clear of debris, as though someone had taken care to keep it that way. That detail stayed with him as he examined the door itself. It was old, reinforced with iron fittings dulled by age, but intact. The hinges were not seized, the wood not rotted beyond use. He searched for modern indicators of construction or maintenance and found none. No concrete, no contemporary fasteners, no signs of recent machinery. Everything about the structure suggested age, but not abandonment in the way ruins usually announce themselves. It had not collapsed inward or surrendered to moisture and decay. It had endured. A faint unease crept in as he documented the site. The earthquake had not destroyed the building, it had revealed it. The soil covering the roof appeared evenly distributed, not the result of slow accumulation alone. There was a uniformity to it that hinted at intention rather than accident. Someone at some point had wanted this place hidden. Protocol required caution. He prepared himself before approaching the entrance, checking air quality, listening for movement, assessing the risk of further collapse. The hillside had stabilized for now, but the earth was unpredictable. He secured his position, adjusted his gear, and recorded the time before stepping closer. The moment he crossed the threshold, the temperature shifted subtly. The air inside was cool but not stale, carrying the scent of earth and stone rather than mold. Light from outside fell across the interior in a narrow beam, illuminating a space that extended deeper than he could see. The walls were solid, the construction precise. This was no crude shelter or improvised hideout. It was a house built with intention and skill, and preserved by the very earth meant to erase it. He did not step fully inside at once. Instead, he stood at the entrance, letting his eyes adjust, listening to the silence that pressed inward rather than outward. There was no immediate danger, no sound of animals retreating, no rush of air. The stillness was complete, as though the space had been waiting rather than abandoned. What unsettled him most was not the presence of the structure itself, but the sense that it had not been lost to time. It had been set aside, removed from the world above without being destroyed, hidden, not forgotten. As he withdrew slightly to continue his documentation, his attention caught on a final detail. Along the stone steps near the threshold, the surface was cleaner than it should have been. Not pristine, but worn in a way that suggested repeated use rather than centuries of neglect. The marks were subtle, easily dismissed, but they contradicted the assumption that no one had been there for a very long time. He logged the observation without comment, though the implication lingered. The plan had been to assess damage, to note hazards and move on. Instead, he had uncovered something that did not fit neatly into any report template. The discovery demanded context, history, explanation, none of which the land offered willingly. As he stepped away from the entrance and prepared to secure the area temporarily, a realization settled in with quiet certainty. Whatever this place was, it was not merely an artifact exposed by chance. It was a threshold, and crossing it would require more than routine inspection. The hillside had shifted, but something else had moved with it, something buried not just beneath earth, but beneath years of silence. He knew then that this patrol would not end when the trail did. The structure had surfaced at the exact moment he arrived in this sector, and the coincidence felt too precise to ignore. With one last glance at the darkened doorway, he turned back toward the forest, already aware that he would return. The discovery had altered the boundaries of his assignment, drawing him into a deeper investigation that the land itself had been hiding. The forest closed around him as he moved away, tall trees standing as they always had, indifferent and unyielding. Behind him, the house remained half buried and silent, newly exposed but far from understood. What lay inside had not yet revealed itself, but its presence had already begun to reshape the course of events, setting in motion a chain of questions that would not rest until they reached their end. He returned the following morning under a sky that carried no memory of the tremor that had altered the hillside. The forest stood unchanged, tall conifers rising in dense ranks, their dark needles absorbing the light and releasing it slowly onto the ground below. From a distance, the slope looked almost ordinary again, as if the land had already begun the quiet work of concealing what it had briefly revealed. Only when he reached the edge of the collapse did the stone emerge once more from the earth, its lines too deliberate to be mistaken for anything natural. This time he approached with purpose rather than surprise. The discovery had followed him through the night, threading itself into his thoughts, refusing to be categorized as a simple anomaly. He had reviewed maps and records after returning to his post, searching for any reference to old structures, forgotten shelters, historical foundations. There had been nothing. No mention in the archives, no notation in maintenance logs, no indication that any building had ever existed in that sector. The absence itself had become a presence, pressing against his certainty with quiet insistence. At the entrance, he paused again, repeating the same checks as before, though the motions now carried a different weight. He was no longer stepping into an unknown ruin, but into a space that had resisted erasure. The door yielded with less effort than he expected. The hinges moved without protest, producing only a muted sound that echoed briefly before dissolving into the stillness inside. The interior greeted him with a coolness that felt regulated rather than accidental. The air was dry, lacking the heavy dampness typical of long-abandoned places buried under soil. His light traced the walls as he stepped forward, revealing stone surfaces worn smooth in places, marked not by collapse but by contact. The layout unfolded gradually, rooms extending inward in a way that suggested planning rather than improvisation. This was not a single chamber dug into a hill. It was a residence shaped by intention and sustained by care. What struck him first was the absence of chaos. There were no collapsed beams, no piles of debris, no evidence that the structure had been surrendered to time. Instead, the space carried the quiet order of a place that had been used with restraint. A low platform against one wall bore the imprint of a sleeping surface, its materials aged but not degraded. Nearby, shelves carved directly into the stone held containers, arranged with deliberate spacing, their contents sealed against moisture. He moved deeper, noting the way objects had been placed to avoid unnecessary noise. Metal rested against cloth, wood against stone. Even the smallest details suggested a consciousness of sound, as though whoever lived here had done so under the constant assumption of listening ears beyond the walls. The thought lingered as he examined a simple cooking area, its surfaces darkened by use, but free of the heavy soot that would have accompanied careless fire. The marks were controlled, consistent, renewed over time. In one recessed alcove, he found supplies that spanned years rather than months. Canned goods with labels, faded to near illegibility, sat beside jars of dried food, their seals intact, their contents preserved with careful attention. There was no sign of hoarding or panic, no excess beyond what survival required. The pattern spoke of patience and routine, of someone who measured time not in days but in seasons. The deeper he went, the clearer it became that this place had not merely been occupied, it had been adapted. The walls bore subtle modifications, niches widened, edges reinforced, angles adjusted to improve visibility or access. Windows, narrow and asymmetrical, were positioned not for light but for observation. From each, the forest beyond could be seen in fragments, chosen angles that revealed approaches without exposing the observer. He found no personal decorations, no photographs, no items that suggested sentiment or nostalgia. Everything served a function. Even the sleeping area lacked softness beyond necessity. The life that had unfolded here was stripped of excess, shaped by a singular purpose that did not include comfort for its own sake. Near the rear of the structure, he discovered the first indication of deliberate concealment beyond the obvious. A section of wall responded differently to pressure, its surface shifting almost imperceptibly under his hand. With careful exploration, he uncovered a narrow compartment concealed behind stone that had been fitted to match its surroundings. Inside lay tools arranged with precision, their edges maintained, their placement exact. Knives, rope, a compact medical kit, each item chosen for utility rather than abundance. Beneath the floor of an adjoining room, accessible through a panel that blended seamlessly into the stonework, he found another space, deeper and more carefully hidden. This one contained fewer items, but of greater significance. A heavy coat folded neatly, its fabric worn but intact. Footwear that bore the marks of extensive travel over rough ground. None of it appeared old in the way museum artifacts did. These were not relics. They were possessions, used and maintained. The realization settled slowly but firmly. Whoever had lived here had not done so briefly. This was not a temporary refuge or an improvised hiding place. It was a long-term habitation, sustained through planning and discipline. The person had known the land intimately, had learned how to take from it without leaving traces that would draw attention. As he continued his inspection, the sense of time became distorted. There were no clocks, no calendars, no obvious markers of years passing. The supplies suggested continuity, not stasis. Food replenished, tools sharpened, repairs made. The structure had not been sealed and forgotten. It had been lived in. It was only when he returned toward the entrance that he noticed the smallest details that challenged the notion of complete abandonment. Near the threshold, a stone had been repositioned slightly, its edge misaligned in a way that was inconsistent with natural settling. On the sleeping platform, a fold in the fabric did not match the rest, as though it had been disturbed recently and not yet smoothed back into place. The air carried a faint trace of smoke that had not yet dissipated entirely, subtle enough to be dismissed but persistent enough to be noticed by someone trained to observe such things. Outside, he circled the structure with renewed attention. What had seemed like an absence of animal activity now appeared as something else entirely. Paths that animals would normally use were disrupted, redirected, as though subtly discouraged. The vegetation near certain sections of the hill had been trimmed back in a way that favored concealment over accessibility. The forest bore the quiet fingerprints of management rather than neglect. Behind the house, partially obscured by fallen branches and shadow, he discovered a narrow opening leading outward, its entrance masked by stones arranged to resemble a natural collapse. It led into the forest at a point where the terrain dropped sharply, providing immediate cover and multiple directions of escape. The passage was worn smooth by use, its edges rounded by repeated contact. Standing there, he felt the weight of implication settle in. This was not a static site to be cataloged and secured. It was a node in a network of movement and observation, a place designed to vanish into its surroundings, even as it remained functional. The idea that it might have been vacated only days earlier refused to leave his mind. He documented everything with care, photographing, measuring, noting positions and conditions. Yet with each piece of evidence he recorded, the temptation to report immediately was tempered by an awareness of how such discoveries were often handled. Without context, without proof of wrongdoing, the site could be sealed, its contents removed, its story reduced to a footnote labeled historical curiosity. Whatever truth lay here would be buried again, this time by procedure rather than soil. He chose restraint. Instead of broadcasting the find, he filed a preliminary note citing an exposed structure requiring further assessment, omitting his deeper suspicions. It was a calculated risk, one taken not out of secrecy but out of caution. If someone had lived here unseen for years, they had done so by understanding systems as well as landscapes. Drawing attention too quickly could erase the very traces he was trying to preserve. As he left the site once more, the forest seemed less neutral than before. The trees stood as they always had, but their stillness now carried an edge, a sense of withheld information. The house remained behind him, half buried and patient, its stone walls absorbing the silence as they had for so long. The transition from discovery to understanding had begun, though he did not yet know where it would lead. What he did know was this: the hillside had revealed more than an old building. It had exposed evidence of a life lived deliberately out of sight, a presence that had shaped the land quietly and with intent. To understand it, he would need more than the physical remnants left behind. He would need history, records, the forgotten details that lingered in archives and unspoken memory. With that realization, his focus shifted. The answers he sought were no longer confined to the walls of the house. They lay scattered across years of reports, missing pages, and closed files, waiting to be connected. The house had given him the first proof that someone had been there. The next step would be to uncover who that someone was and why their existence had gone unrecorded for so long. The house did not leave his thoughts after that second visit. Its rooms lingered in his mind not as a mystery of architecture, but as evidence of intention. Someone had lived there with discipline and caution, shaping their life around invisibility. The realization demanded context, and context could only be found beyond the forest. What the land concealed, the records might reveal. He began with the internal systems of the park, the quiet digital corridors where incidents were logged, summarized, and eventually archived. These were not dramatic files, not the kind that drew attention or headlines. They were procedural documents, written in language designed to be precise and forgettable. He searched for patterns rather than events, filtering by sector, by year, by categories that hinted at absence rather than presence, missing persons, unrecovered remains, closed investigations that ended not with answers, but with exhaustion. The first thing he noticed was how little existed. For a region as difficult and isolated as his sector, the number of recorded incidents was unusually low. Other areas with similar terrain showed a steady rhythm of accidents and near misses, the predictable consequences of human curiosity meeting an unforgiving environment. Here the rhythm faltered. There were gaps where reports should have been, stretches of time where the land seemed to have swallowed people without leaving a bureaucratic echo behind. He widened the scope, moving backward through decades, examining handwritten scans from before digital logging became standard. The language shifted with the years, but the omissions remained consistent. Trails abruptly closed without clear explanation. Patrol routes reassigned without follow-up. Notes that referenced environmental hazards without specifying what those hazards were. It was as if the sector had been quietly downgraded in importance, allowed to drift into administrative obscurity. The name surfaced late in the search, embedded in a case that appeared unremarkable at first glance. A park employee, assigned temporarily to a remote patrol zone, reported missing during a routine inspection. The file contained the expected elements: time last seen, weather conditions, a map marked with a broad search area. The conclusion was brief and definitive. Probable wildlife encounter, no remains recovered. Case closed. He read the report again, slower this time. The coordinates of the disappearance aligned closely with the hillside where the house now stood exposed. The overlap was precise enough to raise the hairs along his arms. He traced the employee's last known route and compared it with the terrain as it existed now, accounting for changes in trails and vegetation. The path would have taken the man within sight of the hill, perhaps closer if conditions required deviation. The search documentation felt incomplete. There were references to teams deployed and days spent combing the area, but the details were thin. No photographs attached, no inventory of recovered items, no mention of specific tracks or signs beyond a general statement about animal activity. The report leaned heavily on assumption, as though the conclusion had been reached early and the subsequent efforts had been shaped to support it. He checked the timeline. The investigation had been closed with unusual speed, especially given the employee's experience and familiarity with the park. There were no records of external agencies being involved, no indication that forensic specialists had been consulted. The park had handled it internally and then moved on. Curiosity sharpened into something more deliberate. He searched for references to the employee's work history, his assignments, his reputation among colleagues. The man had been methodical according to performance reviews, cautious to the point of being criticized for it. Not the profile of someone who would wander carelessly into danger. He had also been known for questioning inconsistencies in maintenance logs and patrol reports. Though these notes were scattered and vague, the kind of comments that rarely found their way into formal evaluations. The more he read, the clearer the shape of omission became. The case was not defined by what it contained, but by what it lacked. No personal effects recovered. No clear explanation of why the body was never found in an area thoroughly searched. No acknowledgement of the terrain's capacity to preserve remains rather than erase them entirely. The narrative rested on convenience rather than evidence. He sought out older records, those stored separately, rarely accessed except during audits or legal reviews. There, in the margins and attachments, he found hints of hesitation. A memo questioning the wildlife conclusion, a request for extended search time that was denied due to budget constraints, a note about unexplained disturbances near a slope that had since been marked as unstable and restricted. The pieces existed, but they had never been assembled. What unsettled him most was the subtle shift in language over time. Early documents used cautious phrasing, acknowledging uncertainty. Later summaries adopted certainty without justification. Somewhere between those drafts, doubt had been edited out, replaced by finality. The case had not been solved, it had been simplified. He cross-referenced the date of the disappearance with changes in patrol assignments. Shortly afterward, the sector had been reassigned fewer resources. Routes were altered, responsibility diffused. It was not a dramatic withdrawal, but a gradual thinning, like a conversation quietly abandoned. The land remained, but attention moved elsewhere. He closed the files and sat back, letting the implications settle. The house on the hillside was no longer an isolated anomaly. It was a fixed point in a pattern of neglect and assumption. If someone had lived there unseen and unchallenged, the disappearance of a lone employee could have been both a risk and an opportunity. A risk because discovery threatened exposure. An opportunity because the land itself offered a ready-made explanation. The idea took shape slowly, resisted at first by the weight of its consequences. If the employee had encountered someone living in the house, the encounter would have been unexpected, dangerous for both parties. A confrontation need not have been dramatic to be fatal. In a place where nature was always blamed first, a human act could vanish without leaving a trace that anyone felt compelled to pursue. He returned to the house that afternoon, not to search again, but to stand within its walls and imagine the moment of intrusion. The narrow windows, the limited light, the controlled layout. A sudden presence at the entrance would have shattered the balance that kept the inhabitant hidden. The tools he had seen, the careful arrangements, the escape routes. They were not the trappings of comfort, but of readiness. In one corner of the room, near the concealed compartment, he noticed something he had overlooked before. A small indentation in the stone floor, worn differently from the surrounding surface. It was not large, not obvious, but it suggested repeated contact, a place where weight had been placed again and again. Kneeling, he examined it closely, tracing its edges. Nearby, faint discolorations marred the stone, subtle and old, but unmistakable once seen. The house did not speak, but it held its silence with purpose. Every element pointed toward a history shaped by secrecy, and secrecy, he understood now, rarely existed without cause. The absence of personal records or written testimony was not an oversight. It was a precaution. As he left, the forest felt less like a backdrop and more like a witness. The trees had stood through decades of change, indifferent to human narratives, yet complicit in their erasure. The land could hide many things, but it could not do so without human assistance. Someone had allowed this place to fade from notice. Someone had chosen not to look too closely. The realization carried weight. To pursue the truth would mean challenging not only an old conclusion, but the system that had accepted it without resistance. The park's reputation rested on the idea that its dangers were natural, its tragedies unavoidable. Introducing the possibility of deliberate harm would disrupt that balance, inviting scrutiny that few institutions welcomed. He knew then that his investigation could not remain informal for long. The evidence he had gathered was circumstantial, but it was accumulating, and accumulation demanded response. He would need to return to the house with a different focus, searching not for signs of life, but for signs of death. And if those signs existed, they would not belong to the distant past alone. The forgotten case was no longer forgotten to him. It had moved from archive to present, from paper to stone. The next step would require confronting what the land had hidden and what the records had ignored. The hillside had already begun to speak. He would have to decide whether he was willing to listen to the rest of the story, regardless of where it led. The decision to return to the house was no longer driven by curiosity, but by obligation. What he had uncovered in the records demanded verification in stone, soil, and shadow. The forgotten case had followed him back into the forest, transforming the structure from a hidden residence into a potential crime scene. The house had not simply sheltered a life lived in secrecy. It had very likely witnessed a death that had been misnamed, misfiled, and quietly buried beneath assumptions. He approached the hillside with heightened awareness, alert to any change that might signal recent activity. The forest was calm, but no longer neutral in his perception. Every broken twig, every shift in the undergrowth, carried the possibility of meaning. When he reached the exposed entrance, he paused longer than before, scanning the ground, the stone steps, the narrow approach framed by earth. Nothing obvious had changed, yet the absence of disturbance itself felt deliberate. Inside, he moved with restraint. This was no longer an exploration, but a methodical search. He documented the interior again, not broadly, but inch by inch, allowing no detail to remain unexamined. His light traced the floor first, following the seams between stone slabs, lingering where the surface changed subtly in texture or color. He had learned over years of fieldwork that truth rarely announced itself plainly. It waited in irregularities. The area near the concealed compartment drew his attention almost immediately. The stone there bore marks inconsistent with the rest of the floor, faint abrasions that suggested movement under weight rather than natural wear. He knelt, brushing away dust and debris, and saw what he had missed before. Darkened patches embedded deep within the stone's porous surface, old and faded, but unmistakable in pattern. They were not random stains. They followed lines, splatters, smears shaped by motion and force. He followed them outward, noting how they thinned and disappeared near the threshold. The pattern told a story without words, a struggle that did not roam freely through the room, but was contained, controlled, ended quickly. The absence of damage to walls or furnishings suggested that whatever had occurred here had been decisive rather than chaotic. It was not the scene of a prolonged fight. It was the site of a single, irreversible act. Nearby, beneath a loose section of flooring that had blended seamlessly into the rest of the room, he discovered what remained of personal effects that did not belong to the occupant of the house. A fragment of fabric, weathered but distinct, bearing the faded insignia of the Park Service. A metal object, bent and dulled, once part of a uniform fastening. Items that should not have been here. Items that had no purpose in the life of someone hiding from the world. He sat back on his heels, allowing the implications to settle. The house had been the setting, not the cause. The violence that occurred here was not the result of desperation or accident, but of necessity, at least from one perspective. The person who lived here had constructed a life dependent on remaining unseen. Discovery would have meant exposure, capture, the end of isolation that had been cultivated for years. The response, then, had been swift and calculated. The staging became clear as he continued. Along the outer edge of the structure, where the terrain dropped sharply, he found disturbed soil that had long since settled, but not erased the marks of alteration. Stones arranged to mimic the signs of animal activity, scratches on wood and fabric that, upon closer inspection, revealed the marks of tools rather than claws. The illusion would have been convincing to anyone expecting nature to be the culprit. And nature in Yellowstone was always the first suspect. He reconstructed the likely sequence. The employee had approached the house, perhaps during routine patrol, perhaps following an irregularity noticed in the landscape. The encounter would have been unexpected for both men. The inhabitant, already practiced in silence and concealment, would have understood immediately what discovery meant. There would have been no negotiation, no attempt to explain. Survival depended on finality. Afterward, the body would not have been left where it fell. The land itself offered solutions, a steep slope, scavengers drawn by scent, weather capable of accelerating decay. By relocating remains to a point where animal activity was expected, the inhabitant could ensure that the search would follow a familiar narrative. Torn clothing, scattered traces, and absence of a body. The park had seen it before and would see it again. What struck him was not the brutality of the act, but the efficiency. This was not a crime committed in panic. It was an action taken by someone who had anticipated the possibility long before it occurred. The tools, the escape routes, the understanding of animal behavior and terrain. Everything pointed toward preparation rather than improvisation. He documented each finding with care, aware that these details could not be explained away once recorded. Photographs, measurements, samples. He avoided disturbing anything more than necessary, mindful that the integrity of the site mattered now in ways it had not before. This was no longer about personal certainty. It was about building a case strong enough to survive scrutiny. As he worked, the weight of time pressed in. The evidence was old, degraded by years beneath soil and stone, yet it persisted. The attempt to erase the act had relied on the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough. That assumption had held until the earth itself shifted. When he emerged from the house, the light outside seemed sharper, more revealing. He stood at the edge of the collapse and looked out over the forest, imagining search teams moving through it years earlier, following false trails, guided by expectations rather than facts. They had been searching for a body claimed by nature, not for a truth concealed by a man who understood the land better than most. He understood now why the case had been closed so quickly. To question the wildlife conclusion would have required acknowledging uncertainty, extending resources, admitting that something human might have occurred where nature was meant to suffice as explanation. The park had chosen the path of least resistance, and the land had cooperated. Yet the land had also preserved what it concealed. Stone remembered pressure, soil remembered disturbance. The house, buried and forgotten, had kept its secrets intact longer than the records that denied them. As he secured the site once more, he felt a shift within himself. The investigation had crossed a threshold. He was no longer uncovering traces of hidden life, but confronting the consequences of that life colliding with the world above. The inhabitant of the house had not merely vanished into the wilderness. He had shaped it, manipulated it, used it as a shield against accountability. The realization carried an unsettling implication. If the man had lived here long enough to commit murder and escape consequence, then his disappearance afterward might not have been an end. He could have adapted again, shifted locations, continued his existence under the same principles that had sustained him here. The thought followed him as he left the hillside, careful not to leave new marks where old ones still spoke. The staged death had succeeded once. Whether it had succeeded entirely remained to be seen. The evidence now rested not only in the ground, but in the ranger's resolve to ensure that what had been buried would not be buried again. The house stood silent behind him, its role in the story now irrevocably changed. It was no longer merely a place of concealment. It was proof, and proof, once uncovered, demanded response. After the certainty of what had happened inside the house settled into his mind, the ranger found that the structure itself began to recede as the central mystery. The stones, the stains, the concealed spaces had already told their part of the story. What remained unresolved was the figure who had shaped all of it. The man who had lived there had not simply hidden from the world, he had erased himself from it, and the more the ranger considered that erasure, the more deliberate it appeared. He began to reconstruct the inhabitant not through records, which were silent, but through habits. Everything in the house spoke of a person who understood time differently from those who lived within schedules and calendars. Supplies were rotated, not stockpiled. Tools were maintained rather than replaced. Nothing suggested urgency, panic, or indulgence. The life lived here had been stripped down to function and patience, as though the inhabitant had accepted from the beginning that this was not a temporary refuge, but a long-term condition. The choice of location alone revealed a level of calculation that went beyond chance. Yellowstone was vast, but it was also monitored, mapped, and crossed by predictable flows of people. To remain unseen within it required more than luck. It required understanding how humans moved through wilderness, where they lingered, where they passed quickly, and where they rarely looked at all. The house had been built into a hillside that lay just outside common patrol routes, close enough to infrastructure to allow quiet access, far enough to avoid routine inspection. It was not isolation by distance alone, but by expectation. The ranger studied the ways the forest around the house had been shaped. Paths that animals would normally follow had been subtly redirected over time. Branches trimmed not to clear space, but to guide movement away from certain angles of approach. Small changes, made gradually, that altered the behavior of the land without drawing attention. Whoever had lived here had not fought the environment. He had collaborated with it. From the pattern of tools and supplies, the ranger inferred experience. This was not a novice learning survival through trial and error. The man had known what he needed before he needed it. He had anticipated injury, illness, weather shifts. The medical kit was compact but comprehensive. The rope was chosen for strength rather than versatility. The knives were maintained to a standard that suggested long familiarity. These were the decisions of someone who had lived outside systems before, perhaps long before arriving here. The question of why remained unresolved. People did not choose lives like this without reason. The ranger searched through public records beyond the park, scanning old notices, missing person bulletins, unsolved warrants that predated the disappearance of the employee. He did not expect to find a name, and he did not. What he found instead were patterns that resonated uncomfortably with what he had already seen. Cases of individuals who vanished during searches, who slipped through jurisdictional cracks, whose trails ended near wilderness areas where explanations became conveniently vague. It was impossible to say which, if any, of those cases belonged to the man in the house, but the overlap was enough to suggest that he had arrived here not as a drifter, but as someone already practiced in avoiding detection. Yellowstone had not transformed him into a ghost. It had offered him the perfect place to become one. The disappearance of the park employee marked a turning point. Before that moment, the man in the house could exist as a shadow, drawing resources quietly, observing from a distance. Discovery threatened collapse. The ranger considered what that confrontation must have been like. The employee would have approached with authority but without fear, expecting perhaps a lost hiker, an illegal camper at worst. The inhabitant, by contrast, would have understood immediately what exposure meant. Years of preparation would have narrowed the options to one. What followed was not the act of a desperate animal, but of a human calculating survival. The staging of the death, the manipulation of evidence, the use of terrain and wildlife behavior to misdirect investigation. These were not improvisations. They were solutions drawn from knowledge and foresight. The man had not fled after the killing. He had stayed, confident that the illusion would hold. That confidence had been rewarded. The case closed. The searches ended. The forest returned to silence. For years afterward, the man could continue his existence, adapting to the rhythms of the park, observing changes in patrol patterns, avoiding new risks. The ranger realized then that the inhabitant had not simply disappeared after the murder. He had become more careful, more disciplined. The house bore the marks of that refinement. What unsettled the ranger most was the possibility that the man had not confined his life to that single shelter. The house was efficient, but it was also a liability once known. A person capable of building such a place would be capable of abandoning it without regret. The hidden exit suggested mobility, not attachment. The inhabitant's life was not tied to walls, but to strategy. The ranger reviewed reports of unexplained disturbances in other sectors, places where supplies had gone missing in small quantities, where cameras had failed briefly without clear cause, where maintenance logs recorded anomalies that were dismissed as technical error. Each incident alone meant little. Together they suggested a presence that moved through the park like a current, unseen but influential. The man who had lived in the house had not been reckless. He had not drawn attention unnecessarily. He had taken only what he needed, left no signatures beyond what could be mistaken for nature. Even the murder, as grave as it was, had been absorbed into the park's long history of fatal accidents. The system had cooperated by assuming the simplest explanation. As the ranger assembled this profile, he became acutely aware of his own vulnerability. To understand someone like this was to recognize how easily such a person could observe others without being seen. The man had lived for years surrounded by people who never knew he was there. Now that the house had been exposed, the inhabitant would know that something had changed. Whether he had left already or remained nearby, the risk was no longer theoretical. The ranger noticed small disturbances around his own routines. Nothing overt. A piece of equipment repositioned slightly differently than he remembered. Footprints near a service road that did not match official traffic. The absence of certain animals in areas where they were usually present. Each observation could be dismissed on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that echoed the signs he had learned to recognize. The man who disappeared into the wilderness had not done so out of ignorance. He had done it with intent, and intent endured. The ranger understood now that the investigation was no longer limited to uncovering the past. It was intersecting with a present shaped by the same logic that had produced the house, the staged death, and the long silence that followed. The question was no longer simply who the man had been. It was whether he was still there, adapting as he always had, observing as he always had, and deciding even now how best to remain unseen. The forest had given him shelter once. Whether it would continue to do so depended on how quickly the ranger could force the truth into the open without becoming another disappearance explained away by the land. As night fell and the park settled into its familiar stillness, the ranger felt the weight of that realization settle with it. The man who had vanished had done so by understanding the system better than those tasked with enforcing it. To confront him would require the same understanding, sharpened by patience and an acceptance that there would be no clear lines, no simple resolutions. Only the slow closing of space between those who watched and those who believed they were unseen. The realization that the past had not stayed buried altered the ranger's movements through the park. What had once been routine now demanded deliberation. He found himself noting the smallest deviations, the quiet inconsistencies that would have gone unnoticed weeks earlier. The forest had not changed, but his relationship to it had. Every trail, every stand of trees now carried the possibility of concealment rather than shelter, of observation rather than solitude. He returned to the house with the intention of confirming what he already suspected. The approach was slower, more careful than before. He circled the hillside at a distance first, scanning the ground for disturbances that did not belong to animals or erosion. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. The slope still bore the scars of the collapse. The stone walls still emerged from the earth with the same mute patience. Yet as he drew closer, the details began to separate themselves from the background. Near the concealed exit at the rear of the structure, the vegetation had shifted. Grass lay pressed in a direction inconsistent with wind or rain. A cluster of stones that had been carefully aligned during his previous visit now sat slightly askew, as if replaced by someone who had not known the exact arrangement. The changes were minor, almost respectful in their subtlety, but they were undeniable. Someone had been here after him. Inside the house, the sense of intrusion sharpened. The air carried a faint trace of smoke that should have dissipated long ago. A container on one of the shelves had been turned so that its label faced inward rather than out. The sleeping platform bore a new indentation, shallow but recent, where weight had rested. These were not the signs of a careless trespasser. They were the marks of someone moving through the space with familiarity, aware of what could be noticed and what could be left behind. The ranger stood still for a long moment, listening. The house offered no sound in return, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. He moved through the rooms again, comparing his mental record with what lay before him. The differences were few, but they followed a pattern. The inhabitant had not taken supplies in bulk. He had removed only what was necessary. A length of rope was gone. A knife that had rested near the concealed compartment was missing. The medical kit had been disturbed. It became clear that the man had not fled in panic. He had departed deliberately, responding to a shift in circumstances rather than reacting to immediate threat. The earthquake had revealed the house, and the ranger's presence had confirmed what the inhabitant likely already suspected. The shelter was no longer secure. Staying would mean gambling on continued invisibility in a place that had already betrayed him once. Outside, the ranger traced the likely path of departure. The terrain dropped away sharply beyond the hidden exit, breaking into a maze of gullies and dense growth that would quickly erase footprints. From there, multiple routes opened into the broader wilderness, each offering different forms of cover. The man who had lived here would not have chosen at random. He would have selected a path that intersected with known blind spots, areas where patrol coverage was thin or intermittent. The ranger mapped these routes against patrol schedules and maintenance logs, looking for overlap. Patterns emerged that were unsettling in their clarity. Certain zones experienced repeated equipment failures, temporary communication dead spots that were logged and resolved without deeper inquiry. Supply shortages occurred in isolated outposts, small enough to be dismissed as inventory error. The park had been feeding someone who knew exactly how to take without being noticed. He began to test the environment in small ways, leaving controlled markers in places where they would be visible only to someone who knew what to look for. A stone repositioned slightly along a rarely used trail. A branch bent into a shape that would not occur naturally. When he returned days later, some of those markers had changed. Not all, and not dramatically, but enough to confirm what he feared. The inhabitant was still nearby, still moving, still aware. The weight of that knowledge pressed heavily. This was no longer a matter of reconstructing history. It was an active situation, unfolding in real time, with stakes that extended beyond the integrity of old records. The ranger understood the danger of acting alone, yet he also understood the danger of acting too openly. A premature alert could drive the man deeper into concealment, perhaps into areas where discovery would be impossible. He prepared a report that walked a narrow line between urgency and restraint. He documented the evidence of recent activity without drawing conclusions he could not yet prove. He emphasized safety concerns, the possibility of an unauthorized individual operating within restricted zones. The response from superiors was cautious, measured, and frustratingly slow. Protocol required review, consultation, verification. The system moved at a pace that favored stability over disruption. Meanwhile, the signs continued. A fuel cache showed signs of tampering. Camera footage from a remote access road contained brief gaps that coincided with nothing in the logs. A gate that should have been locked was found open, then closed again without explanation. Each incident alone could be rationalized. Together, they formed a picture of someone testing boundaries, gauging response times, adapting to scrutiny. The ranger felt the pressure of time acutely. Every day that passed without decisive action increased the risk that the man would disappear entirely, leaving behind only traces that could once again be attributed to nature or chance. The house had been a rare fixed point, a place where evidence could anchor theory. With it compromised, the investigation lost its center. He made the decision to escalate carefully. He shared his findings with a small number of trusted colleagues, those who understood the terrain as intimately as he did. Their reactions ranged from skepticism to quiet concern. Some recognized the patterns immediately, having encountered similar anomalies without ever connecting them. Others resisted the implications, wary of what acknowledging them would mean for the park's image and operations. As pressure built, so did resistance. Requests for additional resources were met with delays. Suggestions of coordinated searches were reframed as routine patrol adjustments. The unspoken message was clear. Without a body, without a suspect, the system would move cautiously, prioritizing containment over confrontation. The ranger realized then that the title he had given the situation in his mind was accurate in more ways than one. It was too late to prevent the inhabitant's departure from the house. It might also be too late to catch him before he vanished again, folding himself into the immense fabric of the park. The man had survived here for years by staying ahead of attention. Now that attention had finally turned his way, he had already adjusted. Still, the ranger refused to accept that the window had closed entirely. The man's movements, no matter how careful, intersected with systems he could not fully control. Supply lines, maintenance schedules, patrol rotations. The very scale of Yellowstone, which had once protected him, could now become a liability if scrutiny tightened in the right places. As night settled over the forest, the ranger stood at the edge of a ridge overlooking a broad stretch of land. Somewhere out there, a man who had once killed to remain unseen was moving again, adapting as he always had. The ranger felt the familiar tension between resolve and uncertainty, the knowledge that pursuit would be slow, incomplete, and fraught with compromise. The investigation had reached a point where outcomes were no longer guaranteed. Evidence could still surface, mistakes could still be made, but certainty was slipping away with each passing hour. What remained was determination, sharpened by the understanding that some truths, once missed, were nearly impossible to reclaim. The house, now empty, stood as a reminder of what had been lost to hesitation and assumption. The ranger knew that even if the man was never found, the discovery had already altered the park's quiet narrative. The land had revealed a flaw in the belief that all dangers here were natural, all tragedies unavoidable. Whether the system would acknowledge that flaw remained uncertain, but the ranger had crossed a line from which he would not retreat. Too late did not have to mean never. Even if the man escaped, the truth of what had happened would persist, pressing against the edges of official explanations, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. By the time the official response began to take shape, the house had already fallen silent in a new way. It was no longer inhabited, no longer actively used, yet it remained charged with consequence. What it had revealed could not be undone, even if the man who had lived there was gone. The ranger understood that the final stage of this story would not be marked by pursuit through the forest or a dramatic confrontation. It would unfold instead through reports, decisions, and the subtle resistance of a system reluctant to look too closely at its own blind spots. He compiled everything with care. The documentation filled folders, both digital and physical, each piece connected deliberately to the next. Photographs of the house and its concealed spaces, measurements of disturbed soil and altered stone, records from the archives highlighting inconsistencies, omissions, and the abrupt closure of the old case. Evidence of recent activity, carefully time-stamped and cross-referenced. Nothing stood alone. Each element reinforced the others, forming a narrative that could not be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. When he presented the material to his superiors, the reaction was measured, cautious, and restrained. No one accused him outright of exaggeration, but neither did they rush to embrace his conclusions. Questions were asked about alternative explanations, about the age of the evidence, about the difficulty of proving intent after so many years. The familiar language of liability and procedure surfaced quickly, framing the discussion in terms of risk management rather than justice. An internal review was authorized, though its scope was carefully limited. The house was designated a restricted site, officially classified as structurally unsafe and environmentally sensitive. Access was controlled, then reduced. The language used in the paperwork emphasized preservation and safety, avoiding any reference to criminal investigation. The structure was treated as an anomaly of history, not a node in an unresolved crime. The ranger recognized the strategy immediately. By reframing the discovery as a matter of land management rather than human action, the system could contain the disruption. The old disappearance would remain officially attributed to nature. The absence of a suspect would be cited as justification for restraint. The park's public narrative, carefully maintained over decades, would remain intact. Yet the quiet truth had already begun to exert pressure. Law enforcement agencies outside the park were notified, albeit discreetly. Their involvement was limited at first, constrained by jurisdictional complexity and the lack of immediate threat. Still, the transfer of information altered the balance. Once shared, the evidence could not be entirely reclaimed or buried. It existed now beyond the boundaries of any single institution. The ranger felt the shift personally. His access changed. Certain systems required additional clearance. His assignments were adjusted, his patrol routes altered. None of it was punitive on paper, but the message was clear enough. He had become an inconvenient presence, a reminder of questions better left unasked. There was talk of reassignment, of moving him to a more visible sector where his attention would be occupied by routine concerns. He responded not with defiance, but with persistence. Copies of his work were secured and stored in places beyond easy reach. He maintained contact with those few colleagues who understood the significance of what had been uncovered. Together, they compared notes, monitored patterns, watched for changes that suggested the park itself was adapting in response to the exposure. The most telling evidence came not from files or meetings, but from behavior. Patrol coverage in remote areas increased subtly. Maintenance schedules were revised. Camera systems were upgraded in places that had long been neglected. None of these changes were announced publicly, but they reflected an acknowledgement that something had gone wrong, even if no one was willing to say exactly what. As weeks passed, there were no confirmed sightings of the man who had lived in the house. No arrests, no recovered remains, no dramatic resolution. Yet the ranger noticed that the quiet anomalies he had tracked began to fade. Supplies stopped going missing. Equipment failures ceased. The subtle disturbances that had once marked an unseen presence no longer appeared. Whether the man had moved on or simply grown more careful was impossible to know. What mattered was that the patterns had changed. The old case was never formally reopened, but it was no longer as closed as it had been. Internally, it became a reference point, a cautionary example discussed in training sessions and procedural reviews without ever being named directly. The disappearance was still attributed to nature in official records, yet the certainty that had once surrounded that conclusion was gone. Doubt, once introduced, had a way of lingering. For the ranger, the resolution was neither satisfying nor complete. There was no confession, no clear endpoint that could be marked and archived. Instead, there was an understanding that some truths did not surface all at once. They emerged slowly, altering behavior and expectations rather than headlines. He returned to the hillside one last time before winter set in. The house was still there, secured and monitored, its stone walls absorbing snow and shadow alike. From the outside, it looked as it always had, a structure half swallowed by the land, indistinguishable from the hill itself to anyone who did not know where to look. The forest around it was quiet, indifferent to human conclusions. Standing there, he reflected on how easily the park had accommodated a life lived in secrecy, and how easily it had absorbed a death misnamed and forgotten. Yellowstone was vast enough to hide many things, and it did so without malice. The danger lay not in the land, but in the assumptions people carried into it, the narratives they accepted because they were familiar and convenient. The quiet truth, he realized, was not that a man had lived unseen for years, nor even that he had killed to protect that invisibility. It was that the systems designed to protect both people and wilderness had been complicit, not through intent, but through complacency. Nature had been blamed because it was easier than confronting the possibility of human wrongdoing in a place celebrated for its purity. As he left the site, the ranger felt no triumph, only a steady resolve. The man who had disappeared might never be found, and the full story might never be told aloud. But the discovery had altered the park's internal landscape in ways that could not be reversed. Procedures had changed. Awareness had sharpened. The idea that all threats here were natural had been quietly, irrevocably challenged. The forest closed in behind him as he walked away, just as it always had. Somewhere beyond the ridges and valleys, the man who had once lived beneath the hill might still be moving, adapting, surviving. Or he might have vanished entirely, leaving only absence in his wake. Either way, the truth of what had happened would no longer rest solely beneath the soil. It lived now in records that could not be erased, in people who would look twice where once they had looked away, and in the understanding that even the most protected landscapes could conceal human darkness as easily as natural wonder. The story would not end with certainty, but with vigilance, and sometimes the ranger understood that was the only ending the truth would allow. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Watch our other videos for more hidden truths and real mysteries. And if this story caught your attention, share it with someone who would appreciate it. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps the channel grow.